Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Sandy Buchanan. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. We'd like to thank you for joining us for this IEEFA webinar on Puerto Rico's electricity system before and after Hurricane Maria. IEEFA has been working for the past 2.5 years with partner organizations in Puerto Rico, including El Puente and the Institute for Competitiveness and Sustainable Economy, to advocate for reform of the electricity system. In the aftermath of the hurricane that devastated Puerto Rico and has still left huge portions of the population without power or running water, the whole world now knows about the fundamental flaws in the island's electricity sector. The question now is whether, in the wake of the disaster, Puerto Rico can build a modern and more resilient electricity system, taking advantage of abundant local solar resources, microgrids, and energy efficiency. Our presenters today are IEEFA Energy Analyst Cathy Kunkel and Anna Sommer, President of Sommer Energy. Cathy and Anna have both provided expert testimony on Puerto Rico's electricity system at the Puerto Rico Energy Commission and have worked closely with our allies on the island. We have a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded and will be available by tomorrow on www.IEEFA.org. If you've called in by phone, please mute your phone during the presentations. You can also mute yourself online, or I can mute the lines of those who have dialed in through the computers. That just helps with the background noise. You'll see a chat box on the GoToMeeting site where you can type in questions, and our speakers will be able to address the questions after the presentation. I can also unmute you if you want to follow up on your question. So thank you very much, and I am now going to turn the microphone over here to Anna Sommer.
All right, thank you. Can you advance the slide, please? So I'll just start with a brief outline of what we'll be talking about today. And before I begin that, I'd like to mention how Cathy and I got involved in electric issues on Puerto Rico. We were first asked to perform expert analysis on PREPA's. I'm sorry, can somebody mute them?
I'm going through and trying to mute everyone who didn't mute themselves.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So we first presented expert testimony and analysis on PREPA's Integrated Resource Plan in late 2015. For those who are not familiar with some of the acronyms that we might be discussing today, I'll just mention that Integrated Resource Plans are analyses that many electric utilities do that are intended to evaluate the state of the current electric system, where the system will be going, what the likely scenarios for fuel, demand, things like that will be in the future, and try to come up with a plan that is least cost. We've since been involved in a couple of subsequent cases. So our experience with PREPA and with Puerto Rico's energy system dates back to late 2015. As we go through the presentation, we're going to talk about some background on Puerto Rico's energy system, just to make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of what the system looked like before Hurricane Maria. Also with regards to the sort of the pre-Hurricane Maria system, we'll talk about some of the financial challenges that are making things difficult for PREPA and for Puerto Rico in general. Then we'll talk about impacts of Hurricane Maria and finally make some recommendations. Next slide, please. So in 2014, Puerto Rico's electricity mix largely consisted of oil-fired generation. There was a small contribution from natural gas and also a somewhat smaller contribution from coal, with very small amounts from wind, solar, and hydro. Next slide. This is a map of Puerto Rico's electric system as it existed before Hurricane Maria. You'll notice that the blue, red, and green lines all indicate primary transmission and distribution lines across the island. And then you also have the names of the major power plants. These are all thermal generators, as well as the megawatt size of those generators. One of the key things that has presented an operational challenge for PREPA before Hurricane Maria, and I think contributes to some of the issues that are occurring now, is the fact that you have most of the load centered in the northern part of the island. San Juan is the capital of San Juan is in the north eastern part of the island, and then you have most of the major plants on the southern side of the island. And so you needed to have a robust and reliable transmission network to get that generation from the southern side to the northern side. The two power plants that do not operate on oil primarily are Ecoelectrica in the south western corner of the island, 507 megawatts, and then the AES plant operates on coal, and that's 454 megawatts. Next slide. One of the key sort of policy goals for Puerto Rico was established by the legislature in 2010, and that's an RPS. These targets are energy-based, they're not capacity-based. So the idea was to get 12% of energy from renewable energy by 2015, 15% by 2020, and 20% by 2035. There were no specific targets for distributed generation, and hydro was eligible so long as it was new hydro or an upgrade in capacity to existing hydro facilities. Unfortunately, as of 2015, PREPA had 181 megawatts of utility scale renewables, and just over 3% of total generation came from those. So it had quite a ways to go to even meet the target. And the targets were intended to be mandatory, but largely PREPA has declined to institute a plan that would actually meet those targets. Also in 2015, PREPA had about 136 megawatts of distributed generation, which was primarily solar-based. Next slide. So by 2020, under PREPA's most recent IRP-related filing, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, they would have had about 4% of their generation coming from new and existing renewables. So that would have included those hydro facilities that I mentioned before, not eligible under the RPS standard. They had also committed to increasing energy efficiency. It was a somewhat modest commitment of 0.2% per year until 2025, when the incremental reduction was stabilized at 1.5%. And to be clear, these reductions are measured as a percentage of total sales. So the absolute number of savings from energy efficiency would have gone down over time because demand is expected to go down. The EE goal was largely incorporated into PREPA's most recent IRP-related filing because of a prior commission order. But as with the RPS, there is it's not totally clear how seriously PREPA took this goal. It never filed a plan to actually meet the energy efficiency goal. It was largely just captured as part of the reduction in the load forecast. So the extent to which PREPA intended to and intends to actually comply with that energy efficiency goal remains unclear. Next slide. So there are quite a few challenges facing PREPA before Hurricane Maria. One of the main challenges was the fact that you had all of these power plants that were largely oil-fired, that had deferred maintenance that was preventing them from running at full capacity. And also the oil-fired plants were not in compliance with a key air quality regulation, the Mercury and Air Toxics Standard. By 2015, PREPA plants were supposed to be in compliance with MATS, and that didn't happen and still has not happened. So far, EPA has declined to impose any penalties on PREPA associated with its lack of compliance for MATS. and it's really not clear when PREPA would actually come into compliance with the MAT standard. That has not changed as far as we know with Hurricane Maria, but it was one of the main reasons that PREPA came to the Commission to ask for approval of the Geary offshore natural gas port. Essentially, PREPA had three options to address MAT's compliance. It needed to switch to a fuel other than oil, including natural gas or renewables. It needed to impose air quality controls on those power plants, or it needed to retire them. And the path that PREPA chose to go down was to ask for approval of this offshore natural gas port. Coupled with that need for additional investment, not just in generation, but also in distribution and transmission. In fact, there was over the next, I think, 5 years, the total of investment on the T&D system was approaching $1 billion, was the fact that PREPA already had high electric retail rates. Retail rates as of 2016, I believe, were about 22 cents per kWh. They had fallen from a previous high of about 27 cents, mostly due to the reduced cost of oil. That 22 cents is approximately double the average rate on the mainland, and it was a real hardship to think about how to invest additional capital and not cause rates to go up even more. The PREPA also had nearly $9 billion in debt. As of a few months ago, it had actually filed for bankruptcy, and it was completely unable to raise any capital in the capital markets, which meant that the pathway to actually raise the funds needed to invest in the gas port, to invest in the T&D system, was unclear, and perhaps not even available to PREPA. Secondly, there is a lack of transparency and public accountability. This is due to a number of factors. One is that Puerto Rico and its generation system is largely exempt from a lot of the public reporting requirements that apply to mainland power generators. So, for example, you or I could readily access information about generation from virtually any power plant on the mainland U.S. above 25 megawatts, and that's not true for Puerto Rico. There's essentially no requirement to report even simple data like generation to regulatory agencies. There was also a lack of transparency and accountability with regards to management. One of the things that we found oftentimes through the course of the cases that we've been involved in is that PREPA would say conflicting information about key pieces of how it operated its system or how it intended to operate its system. And I'll get into one of those examples in a few slides down the road. Sorry, my computer just went blank for a second. Another factor that contributed to hardships for PREPA was declining demand. As I mentioned before, sales were expected to fall into the future, and they had already fallen 5% from 2012 to 2016. That was largely driven by an exodus of Puerto Ricans to the mainland, and that was expected to continue into the future. And then finally, management problems cannot be overstated. There is reason to think that management of the power plants themselves has led to a deferred maintenance backlog, which has in turn led to very high forced outage rates. Forced outage rate is a measure of how much the percentage of the time that a power plant cannot actually produce generation. There was also the somewhat unsettling revelation during PREPA's most recent rate case that approximately $134 million of PREPA funds had been put into discretionary fund to be used in the administrative and general management functional area without any indication of what those funds were used for. I think that's an indication of how little accountability there is of the money that comes into PREPA and where it's going to. Next slide, please. I also want to mention one other challenge that was facing PREPA before Hurricane Maria, and that was losses. So this pie chart shows, I believe this is for 2015, this pie chart shows generation as a percentage dedicated to either customer load, to technical losses, to non-technical losses, and to PREPA internal losses. And technical losses generally refer to the types of losses that you would expect from the transmission of electricity from the generator to the customer. 8% is not all that high compared to what you might expect on the mainland, but what was surprising was to see this non-technical loss factor of 6%. And it's not clear from the documents that we've gotten from PREPA whether that is entirely due to energy theft, i.e. people essentially poaching energy from the transmission or distribution system, more like the distribution system, or if it's from primarily from customers who are not paying their bills. I would say that the information that we got from PREPA in this regard was very much lacking. Next slide, please. So into the future, the PREPA's plan was largely to transition to natural gas. And their primary focus was on constructing this offshore gas port at the Aguirre station. They plan to spend roughly $400 million on that import terminal and then build a combined cycle unit as well to eventually make that one of the primary sources of generation. And again, this unit was on the south side of the island, so part of what was necessary to make that a viable source of generation for most of PREPA's customers was to have the transmission line that reached from the southern side of the island to the northern side. In terms of thinking back to the Commission's, to the legislature's renewable energy goal, rather than 15% by 2020, PREPA was actually aiming to have 15% renewable energy by 2035. So they had a much more modest target to aim for energy, for renewable energy. Next slide. So this chart shows a part of PREPA's fiscal plan that was presented to the PROMESA Oversight Board. This is the board that that has responsibility for trying to figure out how to address the debt that the $9 billion in debt that PREPA has been unable to pay back. And the reason that we show these pie charts is because this is what PREPA was saying to the PROMESA board, but it is not Puerto Rico Commission. They were essentially anticipating a future in front of the PROMESA board that would move to mostly natural gas with a significant contribution from renewable energy of about 18% by 2026. In contrast, the modeling that was presented to the Puerto Rico Energy Commission at roughly the same time of April 2017 had natural gas generation at about 61%, so somewhat close to 57%, but renewable generation at only 5%. The majority would be made up by coal and oil and hydro. So that was just one indication of differing ideas and differing visions of PREPA's future. I would also mention that coupled with this fiscal plan presentation, PREPA was also saying that it intended to move to a system in which it would primarily be a transmission and distribution utility, and generation would be owned by third parties. That's not something that we saw in its filing with the Energy Commission at all. In fact, the key things that were litigated in the cases that we've been involved in is how PREPA builds out generation, in particular natural gas, and where the capital for that that owned generation rather than contracted generation comes from. Can somebody mute their line? There's some background noise. Next slide, please. Before I turn it over to Cathy, I just want to mention something about the history of the Puerto Rico Energy Commission, just in case there are any mistaken ideas about sort of what the role of the Energy Commission has been, and the extent to which it had control over the situation that PREPA now sees itself in. So prior to 2014, there was no Energy Commission. It was established by an act of the legislature in about May of 2014. And part of the charge of the Energy Commission was actually to move PREPA away from, and move the island of Puerto Rico away from fossil fuels and towards wind and solar and energy efficiency. That's actually, that language is actually codified in the act establishing the Energy Commission. So because the commission is so new, we had our first IRP case, our first sort of planning, looking into the future, seeing what the generation and the load of PREPA would actually be in 2015. That was, I think, everybody's first looked into what the state of the system was, how much generation was coming from these different fuels, where PREPA saw themselves going, et cetera. And then we had our first rate case in 2016. So all of these things are very new, and I think the Energy Commission deserves a lot of credit for getting some high quality expert analysis and for being very engaged in these issues. And I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that the Energy Commission hasn't done what it can to extract PREPA from the many challenges that it has found itself in. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cathy.
Great. So I'm going to talk. I think there's an echo here. Hold on. I'm going to talk about a little bit more detail on PREPA's debt, which is obviously a major factor that has constrained PREPA's ability to modernize its system, as well as constraining what can happen moving forward. So PREPA has approximately $9 billion of debt outstanding. It is over $2 billion of it is insured, and it is owed to, basically, in a broad sense, 3 categories of bondholders. Much of the debt is owned by very large investment firms, some of the largest in the world. Some of it is owned by hedge funds who, bought up some of the debt for pennies on the dollar and are hoping to be able to redeem it at a higher value. And a small amount of the debt is owned by smaller investors, pension funds and the like. I want to point out that the total assets of the bondholders is more than $8 trillion. So, the $9 billion that PREPA owes would be, collectively a very small loss for these bondholders as a whole. There have also been questions raised about the legality of the debt, whether there were failures of due diligence on the part of people who are doing these bond issuances. The Securities and Exchange Commission is currently investigating fraud and misrepresentation in the PREPA bond issuances, which could mean that rather than PREPA ratepayers, perhaps underwriters of the debt and financial advisors may be liable for some of the costs here. Unfortunately, these questions about the legality of the prior debt issuances was not something that PREPA's consultants looked at when they were trying to restructure the debt. So one thing that I want to emphasize here is that the debt was incurred for a variety of reasons, but specifically not for capital investment in the generation and transmission systems, which, as Anna has extensively explained, were in very poor condition before Hurricane Maria. So PREPA was incurring debt to pay for ongoing operating expenses, including the high cost of oil. It was incurring debt for political reasons and to avoid raising rates to compensate for declining electrical sales. And the fact that PREPA has $9 billion in debt is crowding out needed investment in the actual physical infrastructure. So in the first rate case in 2016, the Energy Commission approved a rate that would have allocated about 24% of the total rate to pay off this legacy debt. So, that's a significant amount of ratepayer dollars that are not going towards the needed investment in the system. So since 2014, PREPA has not been able to access the capital markets, and it has been, had been since 2014 in ongoing negotiations with its bondholders over restructuring the debt. And PREPA and the bondholders reached an agreement on a proposed debt restructuring deal in late 2015, I believe, late 2016, that would have resulted in less than 15% reduction in the principal on the debt, and it also would have given the bondholders the first priority on PREPA's revenues. So essentially, the first priority on electric rates being paid to PREPA, the bondholders would have the first priority to take their cut of that. Now, the debt restructuring that PREPA had negotiated with the bondholders required the approval of the PREPA board, which, as Anna mentioned, was a federally appointed, federally created control board for Puerto Rico that was established to. Whoever's on the phone, can you please mute your line? Thank you. The PREPA board was created to basically oversee the management of Puerto Rico's debt as a whole. The PREPA board estimated in January of this year that Puerto Rico could afford about 20% of the total debt service in fiscal year 2019, which is significantly less than the small reduction that PREPA had negotiated with its bondholders. And in fact, the PREPA board rejected the debt restructuring deal that PREPA had negotiated because basically it said that it was not affordable and not realistic to expect Puerto Rico ratepayers to be able to pay off debt at that level. And so instead, the PREPA board placed PREPA into bankruptcy court in July of 2017. So PREPA is currently in bankruptcy, and the process that is being conducted in the bankruptcy court is key to basically determining what is the amount of legacy debt moving forward that PREPA ratepayers will be responsible for paying. The bankruptcy process is key to restoring PREPA's access to the capital markets for the future, and potentially also for negotiating deals and decisions about where future investment in the island will be made. I also want to point out that recently, in September, PREPA and the PREPA board have argued to the bankruptcy court that the Energy Commission has been overstepping its authority and attempting to usurp the powers of the PREPA board, which is a very disturbing development that PREPA is attempting to use the bankruptcy process as a way to sort of attack the Energy Commission and try to weaken its authority. So just to sort of summarize our take on where PREPA was before the hurricane, as far as investment in the physical system, it was clear that investment was needed on basically rebuilding this old and outdated infrastructure. It was also clear that sales were had been going down and were projected to continue going down. Not clear by how much. And one of our key arguments is that building out the system in small increments, such as through microgrids or smaller scale generation increments, would be a more capital efficient way of investing in the system than building out the large scale infrastructure projects that PREPA was attempting to build. As Anna mentioned, the development of this LNG port at Aguirre was PREPA's main priority. There was a tremendous amount of uncertainty about when that plant would actually come online, what the benefits would be for ratepayers, who was at risk for cost overruns, et cetera. And in fact, after PREPA was placed in bankruptcy, the main vendor for the LNG port terminated its contract. And there was also, a lot of question of whether PREPA would actually be able to raise capital from the financial markets for this project. And then in the bigger picture, PREPA had told the financial board, the fiscal board, that it aimed to have 30% of its generation contracted through public-private partnerships by 2026. But no detail was provided on how that would occur. So again, tremendous amount of financial uncertainty on how the system would be rebuilt. So this is a photo of the distribution system in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. It goes without saying that this is a devastating event. PREPA has said that 80% of its transmission and distribution system were seriously damaged. PREPA has been working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to restore service. It is projected that it would take about 6 months from the hurricane to restore service. Not clear how accurate that is. And there have also been problems that have arisen in their attempts to restore service that are a result of the poor state of the system before the hurricane. So one key example of that is the Palo Seco plant, which is one of the few plants on the north shore of the island located close to San Juan. The Palo Seco plant had been in bad shape for a while, and then it was damaged by an earthquake in August of this year. And so ongoing problems at the Palo Seco plant and lack of reliability of that plant are leading to difficulties in restoring power to San Juan, and leading to power going on and then going down again because the plant is forced off. So one of the things that the Army Corps is doing is installing modular, smaller scale generation at the Palo Seco site. There have been additional contractors hired to rebuild transmission lines from the south to the population centers in the north. There have been a lot of concerns raised about some of those contractors, one of whom has only been in existence for a couple of years and seemingly does not have too much of a track record for this sort of large-scale project. Generators of all kinds experienced damages, limited damage to significant damage during the storm. All indications are that, by and large, PREPA is basically reconstructing the system as it had previously existed. However, as many people have noticed, this event, catastrophe, has highlighted the need for microgrids and for distributed generation, particularly for emergency centers such as hospitals, many of which have been reliant on diesel backup generators, which is not a reliable solution for the long term, as diesel fuel has also been scarce. Obviously, as Anna alluded to, there has been institutional resistance to renewable energy at PREPA for a long time that would have to be overcome. PREPA is spending more than $1 billion a year on its fuel bill going to off-island oil and gas interests. We have been working with business and environmental interests in Puerto Rico that have been pushing for renewable energy and reform of PREPA for several years. So there's a large base of support on the island outside of PREPA for moving to a more resilient and more renewable energy-based system. And there has been obviously a lot of interest from the solar community in Puerto Rico, and pointing out that solar and microgrids could do a lot to restore power and make a more resilient system for the long term. The governor of Puerto Rico has made some promising comments in that direction after meeting with the CEO of Tesla. That's what that quote is from. So Tesla and Sonnen and several other large solar companies have gotten involved in Puerto Rico. But going back to the issue of the debt, there are many unanswered questions about how much of the legacy debt is going to have to be paid off, and then how this rebuilding is going to be financed. So just to sort of conclude our recommendations here, one of the key challenges facing PREPA before, and that has been exacerbated by the high cost of rebuilding the system now, is the lack of affordability and the need for a debt structure that is actually reasonable and can be supported by the economy of the island, and that ratepayers can afford to pay. And I think at this point, after the destruction of Hurricane Maria, essentially that's going to mean canceling the legacy debt. And the other big part of PREPA's operating budget, besides the debt, has been the fuel costs to offshore oil and gas interests. And a transition to renewables would be a way to reduce and eventually eliminate fossil fuel costs. And our second recommendation is transition to greater reliance on microgrids and renewable energy, both as a way to take advantage of resources that exist on the island, and as well to build in the resiliency that's desperately needed, as this event has shown. And finally, there have been many instances and a lot of evidence of poor management at PREPA, management that's driven by short-term political gain and imprudent use of debt. And we've been calling for the need for an independent administrator to be appointed to sort of oversee and clean up the management of PREPA to restructure priorities and hire the right staff and clean out some of the dead wood. So those are sort of our key recommendations moving forward. And then I also wanted to just conclude by providing some links here to the work that we've done on Puerto Rico's electricity system over the last 3 years. So with that, Sandy, do you want to moderate a Q&A, or how do you want to?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Cathy and Anna. I see one question that was typed in here from Mike Kruger, which was, I think, about the Aguirre gas port. How far along is that port development? Did they break ground?
No, they have not broken ground on the gas port. Anna, do you want to give any more detail on that?
Sure. Yes, I had muted myself, so I was speaking to no one but me. So yeah, they had not broken ground, and I'd also add that shortly after we concluded hearings and briefs regarded to the petition to actually get approval to build the gas port, the main vendor, Accelerate Energy, withdrew their contract. So there was a lot of doubts about the ability of PREPA to actually bring the gas port online in the timeline that it had envisioned, and also doubts about its ability to do that in a cost-effective way. And those have just been exacerbated by the fact that there is now essentially no vendor to actually construct the plant.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Another question was whether we can give background on the Whitefish contract from Bill Weil.
Well, I mean, I think the Whitefish contract, so Whitefish is one of the contractors that PREPA hired to rebuild the transmission and distribution system. It's a small outfit out of Montana with seemingly financially backed by some private equity firms in Texas, as well as a Brazilian operation. And they only have a 2-year track record. It's very unclear why PREPA chose them, and I think there needs to be strong oversight over that contract by the Energy Commission in terms of making sure that that the contract is carried out appropriately. But as far as why PREPA chose that outfit, that is not clear to me. I don't know if Anna has anything to add.
No, I think it's not clear to most people.
There was a follow-up here, and actually I can unmute Bill if you wanted to ask anything else. I think I can, maybe I can't. But whether the commission originally would have required Energy Commission or PROMESA board approval. So apparently not.
I don't know the answer to that. It's not, yeah, I'm not sure that I could answer that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, and I think when people, if want to ask questions, it appears that you'd have to unmute yourself. So if you have a question, let me know. I'm not able to unmute folks. Okay, here's another one. A question, and this is from Ann B. If I give money charitably to the many programs to add solar to Puerto Rico, are there methods to get that distributed grid solar added effectively with no concern about money being funneled off to debt service?
Well, I think that what most of the charitable efforts that I'm aware of now, as far as getting solar to Puerto Rico on sort of emergency basis, are really going towards funding actual solar that either for emergency use or for household use, and would not, I don't think, be going through PREPA in any way. So I don't know that I would see that as a major concern.
Okay, another question here from Adam. Some, such as Musk, are suggesting a 100% solar microgrid is the path forward today. Within context of existing infrastructure, financing, etc., what do you see as reasonable near-term, next 5 to 10 years, target for covering Puerto Rican electricity requirements?
Anna, do you want to take that one?
Sure. That is a great question. I think part of the information that's needed to get a sense of that is to get back the assessment of Puerto Rico's electric system. As far as we know, that's not been provided by PREPA to anyone, including the Energy Commission. I think the investment in solar microgrids will be in large part dictated by what the need is to re-electrify certain areas of Puerto Rico, and also the need to ensure that critical infrastructure is not interrupted if a similar storm comes next year. So it's kind of hard to say at this point. I think, again, it depends on what the prospects are for the existing infrastructure. I just want to emphasize some of the things that Cathy said earlier in the webinar, which is that the hurricane impacted all types of generation. There are solar plants, wind plants, hydro plants. One of the coal units is not operating because of damage from the hurricane. So the sort of long-term prospects of all of those generators coming back online is unclear at this point, and we're just sort of waiting for more information.
Thank you. There's a question from Kate Aronoff. Could you give a quick overview for what other contracts the U.S., ACE, and DOE have entered into thus far, and what kind of work are they doing? Do you have a sense for what their long-term presence in PREPA will be?
So I'm not totally sure what contracts the Army Corps of Engineers has made with companies for rebuilding. I know that there is one, the company whose name I'm forgetting, to bring in some generation 50 megawatt units to the Palo Seco site, which, as I mentioned, is plant in the northern part of the island that was damaged before the storm and where there's a need for generation. I forget the company that's working on that. I would also add that in addition to the Whitefish contract, PREPA has also entered into a contract with a company called Cobra, which is a subsidiary of an oil and gas service company out of Oklahoma. And Cobra has also been contracted along with Whitefish to help rebuild the transmission and distribution system. So, you know, I, again, don't have a lot of detail on that contract, but, you know, certainly points to PREPA's strong ties to oil and gas interests, which is obviously a historic issue on the island. So, Anna, do you know more about the Palo Seco contract? Do you remember about that?
Yeah, the Palo Seco contract is through a company called Weston Power Solutions, WESTON, and very helpfully, the staff at the Sandler Foundation have been tracking a number of those contracts for us. So there's 4 that we're aware of through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. There's the Weston Power Solutions contract to put this 50 megawatts at the Palo Seco site, as Cathy mentioned. There's also a contract through a company called IEEFA Energy that will similarly site generation at the Palo Seco contract, as we understand it. Then the Flora Corporation has a contract to basically commission to address power lines. And there's a contract with a company called Power Secure, and it's not clear what the scope of that contract is. According to the press releases that we have, the total amount of that contract is $40 million. And then FEMA is also involved in helping to restore power lines. I believe that they're paying for the costs of bringing in line workers from other utilities like the Jacksonville Energy Authority. So those are the ones that we're largely aware of, in addition to the Whitefish and Cobra contracts that Cathy mentioned. And then finally, this is not related to Hurricane Maria, but General Electric has a contract to repair the Palo Seco plant as a result of the earthquake that occurred in August.
Thank you, Anna. And I see we have a number of comments from Ruth Santiago, and Ruth also is unmuted if you would like to make those. And just a word to say about Ruth has done just a phenomenal job as an attorney in Puerto Rico working on these cases all along. Just wonderful work. So Ruth, go ahead. Did you want to make a few comments or questions?
Sure. Just to clarify that PREPA filed a bankruptcy-like protection under Title III of PROMESA. So it incorporates many bankruptcy provisions, but it's not, you know, the classic bankruptcy case, right? I mean, it may or may not make a difference. We're yet to see. And then I wanted to mention just a little bit about the contract for GE to repair Palo Seco. It's sort of, I mean, we all know, you know, there's been a huge lack of maintenance at all of the PREPA plants, and Palo Seco, I think, is probably the oldest. I know the first units were built in 1959, and so, I mean, it's certainly this last report that I've seen, August 2017. What's I think sort of a little bit concerning about that is that the person or the firm is PEC, which is Island Structures Engineering, and not because of Puerto Rico, the island, but West Islip, the island. So they are, the way they identify themselves in the report, in this last August 2017 report, is really strange. They were commissioned by PREPA. PREPA paid for the report, but they say that they are a sub-consultant to Sigma Energy Solutions, and that they're doing this for GE. So, I mean, there's been a controversy here about whether Palo Seco could be energized right away to start providing power to the San Juan metro area at least. and maybe not have to wait for the whole connection of the transmission system from southern Puerto Rico, which has been, you know, the big problem. And it seems that this contract is pretty useful to GE and help them get, you know, the big contract to do the repairs at Palo Seco. And whether that's a good idea post Maria right away, as opposed to just electrifying Palo Seco as it is. The document had indicated that Palo Seco would not withstand 60-mile-hour winds, and yet it withstood, you know, sustained 150-mile-hour winds and occasional gusts of up to 200 miles an hour, right? So I think this was something, in other words, that was being done prior to Maria, to the hurricane, and that it should probably have been reevaluated afterwards to be able to, you know, electrify Palo Seco and have it online, so that we here in San Juan, I mean, I'm currently in San Juan because in southern Puerto Rico we have no power, no signal, no connection to internet or phone or anything. But at least, you know, we would have had more power here in San Juan.
Thank you, Ruth. Any other comments, Cathy or Anna, on that? Thank you for getting connected so we could talk to you. We've got a few more questions I want to try to get through. One is from Ted, who says, can you address sales tax avoidance scheme in place for commercial cogen? Do you know if this policy will be expanded in light of Maria? And then with a note, tax abatement may be a better way for fuel tax. Any comments on fuel gen?
I have not followed commercial cogen policy in Puerto Rico. I don't know if Anna has any comments on that.
No, I haven't. And I would say that, you know, that what we see in terms of PPAs, whether it's for cogen facilities or renewable facilities, is just the ultimate price. We don't have any insight into the structure of those deals. So I can't say anything about you know, tax implications of those PPAs or anything like that, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks. And then we have another question here from Adam. Other than deployment of generators, are you seeing any U.S. government efforts related to renewable-based microgrids into Puerto Rico?
I've not heard of anything specific to U.S. government efforts, and I assume that the question pertains mostly to the Army Corps of Engineers and to FEMA's presence in Puerto Rico. Most of the discussion that I've read about and heard from others just relates to the conversations that Puerto Rico is having with the solar and microgrid vendors that Cathy mentioned previously.
Okay. Next questions here from Mike were about, prior to Maria, which stakeholders were most engaged? Business community, environmentalists, public advocates, etc. Since the hurricane, has that changed, and how?
I mean, I would say that at least as far as participation in the Energy Commission proceedings, all of those stakeholders that have been mentioned have been very engaged. You know, the environmental community and the business interests have been pretty aligned as far as wanting to see reform of PREPA, wanting to see affordable electric rates, and greater investment in renewable energy on the island. I mean, I think it's a little too soon to say how that is changing since the hurricane, given that, you know, as Ruth mentioned, that just been severe difficulties in even communications on the island and regrouping after the hurricane. You know, I would say that the groups that we've been working with, El Puente and IEEFA, the business coalition, have continued to be very active after the hurricane as well. Do you have anything to add, Anna?
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that the Commission suspended proceedings on October 6th, I believe it was. So there's, you know, there's essentially a regulatory vacuum, and that's simply a product of the fact that there's no power, no way for folks to communicate on the island. And so the rebuilding of the system is occurring without the involvement of the Energy Commission. And I'm not sure that there's a solution to that. But it's definitely something to keep in mind as we hear more stories about contracts that PREPA is entering into for rebuilding, and thinking about the ways in which some of these solar and microgrid vendors can get involved in that rebuilding process. Because ultimately, not all of these costs are likely to be paid by FEMA or other agencies. Probably some of them will fall on ratepayers, and it's not at all clear to me anyway how that will shake out, and what the costs of the Puerto Rico electric system will be once the whole island is electrified again.
Okay, here's a question from Sergio Nabel. Given the economic devastation in Puerto Rico, shouldn't PREPA and the U.S. Army Corps be planning for significantly reduced rate-based revenue? How can they possibly cover fuel costs of $1 billion a year? Would building renewables now make more financial sense than putting in or rebuilding old transmission power lines?
Well, I mean, I think on the first part of the question, yeah, there's definitely going to be a diminished rate base to support investments in the island after this, both because of people leaving the island and because of the lack of economic activity caused by just the devastation there. Anna, do you want to take a crack at the second half of that?
Sorry, can you say what the second question was again, Sandy?
The question is, wouldn't they be better off rebuilt in a financial sense to put in renewables than to rebuild old transmission power lines?
I think yes. I think the answer is very likely yes. The question is, how does that happen? As I mentioned in the response to the previous question, the Energy Commission doesn't exist in terms of its regulatory power right now. So the sort of the oversight of the planning of the Puerto Rico electric grid and how it is built out is really falling to the Army Corps of Engineers, to PREPA, to potentially to FEMA. It's really not clear, and so I don't know what leverage there is to push all of those agencies in that direction. It sure feels like so far that the inertia is towards rebuilding the system as it existed before the hurricane.
And then there was a second question there from Sergio saying there was a Vox story talking about a wind power farm that is intact after the hurricane, but isn't providing power to the grid. Do you know why?
I would guess that it's because the T&D lines are all down, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. Anything else on that? Anybody knows?
No, I mean, I think that's like a pretty common phenomenon in Puerto Rico, though. That, I mean, there are some of the generators that could be providing power, but aren't, simply because they're not connected in any meaningful way to the grid anymore. There's like no way to get the power to load.
We have a couple more I think we'll just take, and then there's also been a few questions that we can answer at the end about how to get access to the slides. So someone has asked, I don't know who, do you have an estimate, an idea realistic of how long it will take to restore electricity in Puerto Rico? Is the 6-month estimate that the press is reporting at all realistic?
Cathy, do you have a sense of that?
Not really. I mean, one of the challenges is that, PREPA has not really provided any sort of comprehensive information on the state of the system after the hurricane, so it's pretty hard to judge. I mean, I know that the governor of Puerto Rico made a statement about power being restored by the end of December, which seems like it was, very much a political statement made the day after the Virgin Islands made a similar statement. But I would suspect that, especially in some of the more outlying areas, that it could be longer than 6 months.
And there's one last one here from Pat Parento about a Bloomberg report that says that Puerto Rico officials want to use disaster relief funds not to repair the grid, but to rebuild it, and that a competitive bidding process would likely be used to select a partner, and wondering what we make of that story.
That's an interesting development. I mean, it's without having had the benefit of actually reading the article, it does seem a little bit contradictory to the fact that PREPA has already entered into multiple contracts to repair existing facilities and existing T&D lines. So I guess we'll have to stay abreast of that and see whether that actually comes to fruition. There is an element of, is this true? Is this an accurate characterization of what will actually happen, just given the experience we've had with PREPA, prior to Hurricane Maria? So it's hard to comment on the article without having read it, but that's sort of my initial take on, whether that is consistent with what the activity and the actions of PREPA that we've seen so far.
Okay, and there was another a comment here from Bill that the Senate passed the next recovery bill last night, and a question of whether we know whether they have allowed use of funds for solar or only to rebuild the grid as it was.
I don't know. I have not had the chance to look at that yet.
Yeah, I have not either.
Yeah. I know there's going to be a second round of congressional action too on the funds, and I know that some of the senators and others were thinking about trying to get language like that inserted either last night or in the next round. Great, well, thank you, everybody. I think we have mostly made it through the questions, and we appreciate everybody's participation today. We will have the recording of the webinar as well as the slides posted on our website by tomorrow, or if you'd like them before that, feel free to send me an email, sbuchanan@IEEFA.org. And you'll also find all the reports that Cathy and Anna mentioned also on our website. If you are interested in learning more about how you can make a contribution toward providing emergency solar equipment for residents of Puerto Rico, which also came up on the call, you can visit elpuente.us. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye.